The shouts and laughter of children rang through the dusty town square where the makeshift stage had been set. Rough planks nailed together for the midsummer festival, and the orphan girl was shoved forward into the light as though she were nothing more than part of the entertainment, her patched dress hanging loose on her thin frame, her tangled hair catching in the wind, while the crowd snickered at her awkward steps, calling her ugly and small as though her very existence were a joke to them, and she tried to shrink back, but two older girls blocked her path, sneering as they pushed her toward the front, one of them jeering that she was too scrawny even for the hog pen, while the other tugged at her sleeve until the fabric tore, and the crowd roared with cruel delight, their voices pressing in like a storm until her chest burned with shame and she wanted to vanish into the cracks of the earth. But the judge of the festival, a fat man in suspenders with a crooked hat, called out that every child had to take part, and if she was too small to compete, then perhaps the pigs should take her place. And the laughter rose louder, stinging her ears like wasps, yet she stood frozen, bare feet pressed to the boards, staring at the games set up before her. Sacks lined for races, barrels for balancing, ropes for climbing, all designed to humiliate her weakness, and the taste of dust filled her mouth as she whispered to herself that she wished her parents had lived. For even the harshest scolding from them would be better than this. And as she lowered her head, she caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the crowd, a tall figure in deerskin and feathers woven into his braid, standing silent where the shadows met the sun. A Lakota scout whose dark eyes watched her with a steadiness that felt different from the jeers, not pity, but something sharper. And when one of the boys threw a clod of dirt at her legs, she stumbled and bit her lip to keep from crying, and the scout's hand moved to his belt where a small piece of bone jutted out, as if he were already considering it, his thumb running across the surface as though testing the shape it might become. And she felt the weight of his gaze, though no one else seemed to notice him. The crowd too busy chanting for her to run, climb, dance, anything that might amuse them, and the festival master bellowed again, telling her to prove she wasn't useless, and the sun burned hot on her back as she tried to summon strength in her trembling legs, knowing that every move would only bring more laughter. Yet somewhere inside, past the ache of shame, there was a small, stubborn ember that refused to die, the same ember that had kept her alive through cold nights and hungry mornings. And she straightened just enough to catch another glimpse of the scout, who now pulled a small knife from his pouch and held the bone in his palm, his lips curving in a faint, almost invisible smile. And in that moment she sensed that something was about to change, that the cruelty of the crowd would not be the last word spoken over her. And as the judge barked for the first contest to begin, she lifted her chin slightly, a spark of defiance flickering in her tear-brimmed eyes, while in the shadows the Lakota's knife carved the first faint line across the bone, the start of something no one else could yet see, but something that would not stay hidden for long. The orphan girl's breath came shallow as the judge bellowed for her to line up with the other children at the start of the sack race. The rough burlap pressed into her arms as one of the older girls shoved it at her with a sneer, and when the whistle blew, she stumbled forward, her thin legs tangled in the fabric almost at once, sending her face first into the dirt while the other children bounded ahead with shrieks of laughter, and the crowd roared with approval as if her failure were the best entertainment of the day. Some even clapping and shouting that she was proving them right, ugly and small and good for nothing. And though her knees scraped and bled, she pushed herself upright, lips trembling as she tried to keep moving, but the jeers grew louder until her chest burned with a kind of numb ache, and just when she thought she might collapse again, she felt it, eyes on her, steady, unwavering, pulling her gaze toward the edge of the square where the Lakota scout now stepped into the light, his broad shoulders cutting a stark line against the sun. And for a heartbeat, the noise of the crowd seemed to dull as he strode closer, his braid swinging, his knife flashing once as he whittled the bone in his hand, and people began to notice, voices faltering as they whispered about his presence, wondering what business a Lakota had at their children's festival. But he did not slow, only knelt by the orphan girl where she had fallen again, and offered his hand, his voice low yet carrying as he said she need not bow to laughter. And the girl froze, half in fear, half in awe, while the crowd erupted, some shouting angrily that he had no right to interfere, others muttering that the child should get up herself. But the scout ignored them, lifting her gently to her feet and brushing the dust from her arm with surprising tenderness before pressing the rough-carved piece of bone into her palm, its edges already shaped like the beginnings of a crown. And the girl stared at it wide-eyed, feeling something stir deep inside that no mockery could reach. But the judge shouted that this was an outrage, that no savage would turn their festival into a mockery. And his words fanned the crowd's unease into anger, voices rising again with shouts to send the Lakota away. Yet the scout only stood straighter, his eyes sweeping the crowd with calm defiance, and the girl clutched the bone as though it were her only lifeline, sensing that the world had shifted in an instant, that kindness itself could be dangerous. And as the crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with both curiosity and contempt. The festival no longer felt like a game, but the start of something perilous. And she could not know whether the crown he carved would save her, or make her the target of even greater scorn. But she knew the moment was not finished. Not yet, and whatever came next would test more than her small frame. It would test her very will to stand. The square boiled with voices as the Lakota scouts' calm defiance clashed against the judge's barked commands, settlers crowding closer with their faces tight and suspicious, mothers pulling their children back, while men muttered that it was dangerous to let a savage stand beside the orphan girl as if she belonged to him. And the girl felt the heat of every gaze as she clutched the half-shaped crown in her palm, the sharp bone edges biting into her skin, yet grounding her in a way that steadied her trembling knees. But the judge stomped forward and jabbed a finger at her chest, spitting that she was bringing shame on the festival by allowing herself to be touched by such filth, that she was too ugly and small to be worth defending anyway. And the words stung more sharply than the dirt clods thrown at her earlier, though before she could shrink away, the scout's hand lifted, palm open and steady, and in a voice that carried through the rising storm, he told them all that strength was not in size or beauty, but in the heart that refuses to bend, his words simple yet rolling like thunder through the tense square. And though most scoffed or shouted back, a few in the crowd went still as if struck. But the judge sneered louder, calling for the contest to continue and ordering the orphan girl to climb the rope tower to prove she could at least touch the sky before falling like the weakling she was. And the crowd pushed her toward it with jeers and laughter, their anger at the Lakota pouring onto her small frame, and she felt her stomach twist with fear. Yet as she glanced back, she saw him again, standing unmovable, knife flashing as it shaved another curl from the bone, his eyes locked on hers with a steadiness that whispered she was not alone. And with that faint spark in her chest, she gripped the rope, splinters biting her palms as she began to climb, while the crowd shouted wagers on how fast she would fall, her arms trembling but her spirit stubborn, and every time she slipped, she caught herself with a gasp, until suddenly the rope burned raw across her skin and she nearly lost her hold, dangling in open air as the mob howled, and she realized the laughter had changed. Not joy now, but hunger for her to fail, for the Lakota to be shamed through her defeat. And when her fingers gave way and she tumbled back down hard against the dirt, the impact knocking the wind from her chest, the square erupted in triumphant cheers. But through the ringing in her ears she felt a hand steady her shoulder, the scout kneeling once more, pressing the half-carved crown back into her palm as though it belonged there, and the hush that followed was heavier than the laughter, a silence pregnant with danger. For now the whole town seemed to see the crown not as a trinket, but as a challenge, and the girl understood dimly that this was no longer about games. It was about power, pride, and the storm that his gift had just unleashed. The festival square that had once been filled with the shrill noise of children's games now throbbed with the darker rhythm of muttering voices and restless feet. The settlers no longer amused but unsettled. Their laughter turned sharp as knives as they whispered that the Lakota scout had bewitched the orphan girl, that the crown in her small hand was no toy but some heathen charm meant to mock them. And she felt their stares drilling into her, as though every man, woman, and child wished the ground would swallow her whole. Yet the scout stood at her side like a rooted tree, his calm silence more provoking than if he had shouted. And when the judge's face flushed red, he roared that no savage would turn their wholesome games into a farce, demanding the crown be thrown into the dirt. But the girl's fingers curled tighter around it, knuckles white with the stubborn flame that had kept her climbing, even when her body failed. And when she shook her head, tiny but unyielding, the murmur of the crowd rose like a brewing storm, some men stepping forward as if to rip the crown from her by force, and she heard scraps of their fury. "Send him back to his people, teach the brat her place, burn the trinket," each word making her chest tighten. But when she dared glance up, the scout met her eyes with a steadiness that poured steel into her trembling frame, and without a word, he drew a small pouch from his belt, sprinkling fine shavings of wood onto the dirt as he carved deeper into the bone, the knife clicking softly in a rhythm that carried over the angry mutters. And the girl realized with a sudden jolt that he was shaping not just a token, but a true crown, piece by piece, and that the crowd's anger was really fear that something so simple as kindness could expose their cruelty for what it was. And as the judge barked for the next contest, balancing on barrels set high for all to see, hands shoved her forward, children laughing again, though now it felt hollow. But she pressed the bone crown to her chest like armor, her breath ragged as she climbed onto the slick wood, every wobble greeted with eager gasps for her fall. Yet each time she steadied herself, clinging to balance through sheer will, and above the din, she caught a hawk's cry circling overhead, the sound sharp and clear like a warning bell. And in that piercing note she felt the same defiance stirring that she saw reflected in the scout's eyes. Though when she finally slipped and scraped down the barrel, the laughter burst out crueler than before. The judge declaring her a failure and spitting that the crown was nothing but garbage. But as she lay bruised on the dirt, the scout knelt once more, setting another carved piece gently onto the forming circle and placing it back into her hand with a firmness that told her it mattered more than the jeers. And as the crowd surged closer, their voices merging into an ugly roar, she understood dimly that the crown had become dangerous not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. And that meaning was about to be tested in a way neither she nor the scout could yet imagine. The air in the square grew thick, the kind that made every breath taste of dust and smoke, though no fire burned yet. And the orphan girl clutched the half-carved crown so tight her nails dug into her palm, the sting of pain the only thing keeping her from shaking apart as the judge's voice cracked like a whip, shouting that the games were finished, the festival spoiled, and if no one had the backbone to act, then he would see the savage thrown out himself. And his words sent a surge through the crowd, men stepping forward with fists clenched, women tugging children away as though the scout carried plague. But he did not move, only watched them with the stillness of a hawk circling the prairie sky, his knife glinting once as he cut another notch into the bone. The rhythm steady, as if time itself bent around his patience, and that calmness enraged them more than any insult could, for they wanted him to flinch, to retreat. Yet he stood like a rock in the stream while the girl trembled beside him, wishing desperately for her parents, for anyone to hold her hand in the rising tide. And in that moment the hawk itself wheeled lower overhead, its cry tearing through the tension and drawing every eye upward, a shiver passing through her as though the bird carried the weight of her fear into the sky. And when it vanished into the sun, she felt strangely lighter. Though the men advancing erased that comfort fast, one seizing her wrist so roughly she gasped, trying to wrench the crown free, but the scout's hand shot out, iron strong, clamping on the man's arm until he released her with a curse, stumbling back as if shocked that he'd been touched, and the murmurs broke into chaos, some shouting for the sheriff, others demanding the scout leave before blood was spilled. But the judge's face twisted darker, declaring that the girl was cursed, that no orphan with a savage crown could bring anything but ruin. And the word cursed echoed like poison through the restless square, making her chest lock as though she'd been branded. Yet the scout dropped to one knee, speaking low enough for her alone, telling her the word meant nothing if she chose not to carry it, that her worth was in her will, not their hate. And though tears blurred her sight, she nodded faintly, clutching the crown to her chest as if it were her heartbeat. And when the crowd surged again, voices blending into a rising roar, she knew the games were over and something far more dangerous had begun. A battle not of contests but of dignity and belonging. And the first crack of that storm had just split open before her. The sheriff's boots struck hard against the planks as he pushed through the square, his badge flashing in the sunlight, his jaw clenched tight as the crowd parted for him like water bending around stone. And the orphan girl felt her stomach twist when his shadow fell across her, his voice cold as iron as he told the Lakota scout he had no place here, that carving heathen charms for a white child was nothing short of provocation. And the settlers murmured in agreement, their faces eager, hungry for punishment, while the judge puffed his chest and barked that order must be restored before the festival turned into a riot. And when the scout did not move, did not lower his gaze, the sheriff's hand went to his revolver, the sunlight glinting cruel off the barrel, and the girl's heart lurched as though the world might end in that instant, her small fingers tightening around the crown until blood welled where the bone edges cut, and she wanted to scream, but her throat locked, dry and powerless. Yet above the tense silence, the hawk's cry split the sky again, sharper this time, as if warning that even stone could break, and the scout lifted his chin, meeting the sheriff's glare with calm defiance. But when he slowly set his knife back into its sheath, the crowd jeered, twisting the gesture into weakness, and the girl's hope faltered as whispers spread that he would be dragged away in chains, that she would be left alone again, mocked worse than before, cursed and crownless. And when the sheriff barked for him to step aside and leave the child, she felt her knees buckle. Because what if he did? What if she was nothing but a burden? A nameless girl mocked for sport, her last spark of dignity slipping through her fingers. And in that moment she hated herself for believing even for a breath that someone could stand for her. Yet the scout still did not move, only looked at her with a steadiness that pierced the panic thrumming in her chest. But the crowd drowned it out, shouting for him to be thrown out, for the crown to be smashed. And as rough hands closed around the scout's arms, she saw him pulled down to one knee, strength pressed beneath numbers, and the bone crown tumbled from her palm into the dirt, its pale surface catching the sun for one fragile instant, before a heavy boot crushed it into the dust. And she let out a sound half cry, half gasp, as though her heart had been broken with it, for in that single moment it seemed all was lost, the crown destroyed, the scout restrained, the sheriff's gun gleaming and the crowd's cruel triumph swallowing every scrap of hope that she had tried to keep alive. The laughter turned sharper that night, echoing off the clapboard walls of the tavern where townsfolk drank and muttered about curses and savages. And when Mara dared to walk down the street with her small crown of twigs, a stone clattered against her ankle and sent her stumbling as a voice jeered that she should bow like the runt she was. Her cheeks burned, but she straightened, refusing to cry until a heavy hand clamped on her shoulder and spun her into the sneering face of Elias, the blacksmith's son, who snarled that her toy crown was an insult to real folk, and raised his fist as if to smash it to pieces. Before the blow landed, the Lakota scout appeared out of the shadows, his presence sudden and still as a drawn bowstring, and in a low voice he told Elias to test his strength on someone his own size. For a moment the street seemed to hold its breath, the crowd shifting uneasily as Elias blustered that this wasn't the scout's fight, yet no one missed how his knuckles trembled when the scout's calm eyes pinned him. Mara clutched the crown tighter, heart hammering, torn between fear that she had caused too much trouble and awe at the way the scout stood like a tree rooted against a storm, until Elias finally spat at the dirt and backed away muttering curses, leaving the tavern-goers to whisper about the boldness of a girl and a Lakota standing against the town's cruelty. The scout did not linger, but walked her back to the edge of the livery, where the horse nickered softly, and there in the quiet, he crouched so his eyes were level with hers, telling her she had more courage than any of the men who mocked her, and that strength was not in fists, but in refusing to bend. His words sank deeper than the insults had ever cut, stirring something fierce in her chest, as though she could feel a fire that belonged to her alone. That night, Mara lay awake in the hayloft, tracing the crooked edges of the twig crown with her fingers, hearing again the stone clatter and Elias's sneer, and she wondered if she had already crossed a line, if the crown was no longer just a child's trinket, but a banner that demanded she face whatever came with her chin high. Down below, the horse shifted, restless, as though sensing storm clouds of conflict gathering beyond the festival lights, and in the distance, a dog barked sharp and insistent before falling silent, leaving the night too still. Mara whispered to herself that she was not small, not ugly, not worthless, that she was something the mockers would never understand, and she swore to wear the crown no matter who tried to tear it from her. Yet as sleep finally dragged at her eyes, she could not shake the image of Elias's clenched fist and the way others had begun to watch her with something darker than laughter in their gaze. The chapter closed with the twig crown glinting faintly in moonlight, fragile yet unbroken, as though waiting to be tested by a fire greater than words. Dawn crept over the town like a timid whisper, but Mara did not notice the light as she clutched the small twig crown close to her chest. The memory of Elias's sneer and the tavern confrontation still burning in her mind. And when she stepped out into the street, the quiet seemed false, each footstep echoing against shuttered windows as if the town itself were holding its breath. And then a sharp voice cut through the morning, calling her name in a sneer. Elias had returned, flanked by two older boys who carried sticks and jeers like weapons, and Mara froze, her heart hammering. But before she could retreat, the Lakota scout emerged from behind the corral fence, his eyes dark and steady, every movement calm yet commanding, as if he alone could bend the air around him. And Mara felt a spark of courage stir despite the fear, for she knew he would not leave her unguarded. And as the boys closed in, Elias laughed cruelly, saying the crown was a joke, that no girl could ever be worth the trouble of defending, and then swung his stick toward her head, and Mara ducked, her small hands clutching the crown tighter, but the scout moved faster than her mind could follow, his own staff intercepting the blow with a crack that sent a shiver through the group. And the older boys stumbled back, eyes wide, while the scout's gaze cut straight to Elias, unyielding. And for a heartbeat, the boy's bravado faltered, his sneer faltering into uncertainty, and Mara realized that the crown in her hands, fragile though it was, had become more than twigs. It was a symbol of defiance, of someone willing to stand when the world whispered she should bow. And when she rose to her full height, Small though she was, her eyes met Elias's with a quiet fire that mirrored the scout's steady calm. And he hesitated, then laughed nervously, raising his hands in mock surrender as if unsure whether to strike or flee. And behind him, the two boys glanced at each other, suddenly aware that the girl they had mocked had an invisible shield stronger than any fist, and Mara felt a rush of something fierce in her chest, a pride mingled with fear, and the scout leaned closer, murmuring that courage was tested in moments like this, that fear was the proof of bravery, and as the sun climbed higher, glinting off the crown's crooked twigs, Mara raised her chin, feeling the weight of the day pressing down, yet knowing she could not falter, that this was the fire she had been shaping in secret, the one the town could not snuff out. And as Elias finally stepped back, muttering curses and shaking his head, the crowd that had begun to gather in the alley whispered among themselves, some in awe, others in disbelief, and Mara knew that the test had only begun, that the crown she carried, the one carved in secret and held close with trembling hands, would be challenged again and again. But she also knew that she no longer faced the world alone, for the Lakota scout's presence was more than protection. It was a promise that the fire inside her could burn brighter than any mockery. And as the hawk's cry split the morning sky, high and piercing, Mara's lips curved into the faintest smile, fragile yet unbroken, the crown held steady against her chest, ready for whatever trial might come next. By mid-afternoon, the town square had grown crowded again, not with laughter, but with murmurs of curiosity and tension, and Mara felt the small crown pressing against her chest as she walked beside the Lakota scout. Every step measured, every heartbeat loud, for whispers had reached the ears of those who still sought to humiliate her. And the blacksmith's son Elias had gathered a few of the bolder boys from the festival, their faces twisted with lingering resentment. And as Mara stepped onto the cracked boards of the old stage, they surged forward, shoving one another as though to test her courage, and she froze for only a heartbeat before the scout's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, steadying her, whispering that true strength showed in the eyes, not the fists. And Mara inhaled, feeling the sting of fear and defiance mingling. And then Elias stepped closer, his fist raised, sneering that the crown had made her bold, that she had no right to be proud. But before he could strike, a sudden shift of movement drew the crowd's attention. The scout stepped forward, knife gleaming in the sunlight as he carved a final notch into the crown he had fashioned from bone, the sound sharp, deliberate, and it rang over the restless murmurs like a signal, and Mara felt a warmth spread from the crown into her chest, a steady flame that replaced her shaking with resolve. And when Elias lunged, she met his charge with unexpected swiftness, her small hands holding the crown up as if it were a shield. And the moment froze. The crowd gasped as the scout moved behind her, his presence a silent warning. And Mara realized that courage was contagious, that the children and townsfolk who had watched her mocked now held their breath in wonder, unsure whether to intervene or simply bear witness. And the air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation, each heartbeat echoing in her ears, and as Elias faltered, his bravado cracking against her steady gaze, the scout spoke, his voice carrying over the murmurs, telling all that honor was earned by deeds, not mockery. And the words cut through the tension like a blade, and in that instant, Mara felt the crown's power, not magic, not spell, but the embodiment of defiance, of persistence, of someone who refused to bow, and she lifted her chin higher, staring straight into Elias's eyes, as though challenging not just him, but the very fear that had ruled her for so long. And when he finally staggered back, muttering curses and shame, the crowd erupted. Not in jeers, but in quiet acknowledgement, some nodding, some whispering that perhaps the girl was stronger than they had believed, and Mara felt tears sting her eyes, a mingling of relief, pride, and an exhilaration she had never known. And the scout reached for her hand, brushing the dust from her sleeve. And Mara took it, feeling the steady warmth of his presence. Knowing that while battles would come again, she had crossed the threshold from fear to courage. And the crown, crooked yet firm in her small palm, gleamed in the sunlight like a promise that no mockery, no cruelty could ever erase what had been forged in these moments of fire, defiance, and unyielding spirit. Dawn broke over the quiet town, but Mara was already awake, the small bone crown lying beside her on the straw in the orphanage loft, catching the soft golden light that filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, and she traced its edges with trembling fingers, feeling the weight not of the bone itself, but of every trial it had carried her through. From the laughter and jeers of the festival to the threats in the tavern and the square. And she understood for the first time that courage was not loud, but steady, a flame that refused to be snuffed out no matter the wind. And when she descended the narrow stairs to the courtyard, the Lakota scout waited, his braid catching the morning sun, eyes calm yet alert, and Mara held the crown out to him, unsure whether to offer thanks or a piece of herself. And he shook his head slightly, gesturing that it was hers to keep, a reminder that she had claimed her place through her own will, not through his protection. And as they stepped into the town square, the settlers had begun to gather again, not with scorn, but with tentative curiosity, whispers spreading that the small orphan girl who had faced ridicule and fists now stood unbroken, that the crown had endured even when it had been crushed into dust, and Mara lifted it to her head, crooked yet perfect in its imperfection, feeling the pulse of all the courage it represented. And as she turned, the hawk that had circled overhead in the darkest moments swooped down to land on a post near the stage, its sharp eyes scanning the crowd as if acknowledging the girl's triumph. And in that moment Mara realized that strength could come from those who refused to bow, that dignity was not given, but taken. And she caught the gaze of Elias across the square, who lowered his head in reluctant respect, the fire of mockery finally extinguished in his eyes, and as the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of admiration trailing behind them. Mara and the scout walked to the edge of the town, where the wind stirred the dust into tiny spirals, and she placed her hand over the crown, feeling the carvings smooth under her palm, each notch a memory, a victory, a defiance that would not fade. And the scout nodded once, silently acknowledging that she had earned more than just survival. She had claimed her own story, her own honor, and in the sky above, the hawk lifted once more, soaring toward the horizon with wings wide and free, and Mara watched it go, understanding that though she was small, she carried the heart of someone immense, a spirit unbroken, crowned not by bone alone but by courage. And as the sunlight touched her face, warm and steady, she whispered to herself that no laughter, no cruelty, no fear could ever take that from her. For the crown she wore was not just a gift. It was a promise that she would always rise. And with that thought, she stepped forward into the day, unafraid, unshaken, and wholly herself, the crown gleaming like a beacon against the endless sky.